royal hall of the Ukuta kingdom pulsed with energy. Every corner of the space reflected the splendor of African royalty. Pillars of worked gold supported the ceiling, where vibrant fabrics, dyed in colors that seemed to capture the African sunset, waved gently in the breeze. The music, rhythmic and engaging, echoed throughout the hall, played by musicians dressed in traditional costumes. Guests moved in tune with the melodies, smiles spread, glasses clinked, and laughter filled the air, creating an atmosphere of celebration and anticipation. Everyone was waiting for the big moment, the entrance of Zuri, the princess whose beauty was described as a gift from the gods themselves. When the master of ceremonies announced his arrival, the entire hall fell silent. All heads turned to the arch decorated with hibiscus flowers and golden palm leaves. The drums stopped for a moment, and the sound of Zuri's racing heart seemed to be the only noise in the world. She walked in with elegant steps, wearing an outfit adorned with precious stones that sparkled like stars. Her braided hair glowed with aromatic oils, and her skin, the color of gleaming ebony, seemed to absorb the light from the torches around her. The vision was stunning, a true dream come true. But the moment Zuri took her first step into the room, something unusual began to happen. First, a man near the entrance wrinkled his nose and looked around in confusion. He mumbled something to the woman next to him, who made the same gesture. Then, like a silent wave, the discomfort began to spread. People discreetly placed their hands on their faces, fanned the air in front of their noses. Some moved away from Zuri's path with suspicious looks. Initially, Zuri didn't notice. She held her head high, with a slight smile on her lips, focused on impressing the guests and especially her father, King Winyi, who watched her from the throne at the back of the hall. But then came the murmurs, short, broken sentences, echoing like sharp knives in the silence. What is that? Does she know? It's impossible. Zuri's smile faltered when she realized everyone was looking at her, but not with the admiration she expected. It was something different, almost scary. A strong and unpleasant smell, which seemed to come out of nowhere, had dominated the room. His gaze met Mwinyi's, who was frowning in a mixture of discomfort and disappointment. Slowly, as if she had been hit in the chest, Zuri realized that the odor was coming from her. Chaos took over. Some guests tried to hide it, fanning the smell with fans while whispering among themselves. Others, less restrained, began to hurriedly leave, covering their noses with handkerchiefs and making sounds of disapproval. Zuri felt as if the ground was crumbling beneath her feet. Her body was shaking, but she couldn't move. Tears threatened to spill, but she fought to keep them contained. It was like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. The music had stopped completely. Only the hurried footsteps of guests leaving the room and sharp whispers filled the space that had once been a celebration. Zuri, the king's voice cut through the silence like a whip. He descended the steps of his throne with heavy steps, his expression mixing concern and disappointment. My daughter, what is happening? This smell is unbearable. Zuri tried to respond, but the words died in her throat. Finally, between sobs, she managed to murmur, Dad, I don't know what to do. No matter how hard I try, it won't go away. His voice was a whisper filled with despair. When he looked around, seeing the faces of the few guests still in the room, all avoiding eye contact, he closed his eyes and sighed deeply before saying, with a tone that sounded more like a verdict than an order, Withdraw, Zuri. I can't allow this to continue. Those words were a final blow. Zuri, with tears now flowing freely, turned and ran out of the room. His breathing was ragged. His heart felt like it was about to explode. The palace corridors seemed too long. The walls seemed to close in around her. When she finally reached her room, she slammed the door shut and collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Outside, she could still hear the distant murmurs and muffled laughter of the guests leaving. That should have been the day she would shine like the star of the kingdom. But instead, she had become the center of a scandal from which she feared she would never recover. The sky above the kingdom of Okada looked like a living painting, painted with orange and lilac tones that heralded the end of the day. The fields around the palace spread out like a carpet of tall grass and wild flowers, dancing in the gentle breeze. For Zuri, this vast space was a refuge, far from the judgmental looks and the murmurs that followed her everywhere within the palace walls. Here she could breathe, even though her own smell reminded her of the reason for her loneliness. With slow steps, she walked between the acacia trees, the curved branches creating shadows that protected her from the remaining heat of the sun. Each leaf whispered in the wind, seeming to comfort his hurting soul. Zuri crouched down near a crystal-clear stream, letting her fingers touch the cold water. For a brief moment, she wished that stream could wash away not only the dust from her hands, but also the burden she carried. It was then that a subtle noise caught his attention. The sound of footsteps on the grass, light but deliberate. His body stiffened. It was unusual to find someone in that place. She looked up and saw a young man. He was crouched a few meters away, picking herbs from a bush. His posture was calm, and there was something curious about the way he moved with precision and care. He was thin, but his arms and hands were strong, as if accustomed to manual labor. His clothes were simple, made of linen, and he wore a necklace of wooden beads that glittered in the setting sun. For a moment, Zuri thought about running away. He would definitely recognize her. Who wouldn't recognize it? She was the princess of Akata, even if now she felt more like a prisoner. Before he could make a decision, the young man looked up and saw her. Instead of the look of surprise or contempt she expected, he smiled slightly, as if his presence was something natural there. "Princess Zuri," he said, his voice low and soft, thick with the accent of the neighboring village. The sound of her name coming from that stranger was unexpectedly comforting, like a reminder that she was still someone beyond her shame. "Yes," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. He neither approached nor retreated. Instead, he turned his attention to the plan in his hands. "I'm gathering herbs to make medicine," he explained, casually, as if it were the most common thing in the world to talk to a princess exiled in the countryside. Zuri frowned. She expected him to avoid her, to try to move away discreetly, like everyone else did. But he didn't seem bothered. She then asked, almost without thinking, "You know who I am, right?" He nodded. "And that doesn't bother you?" she insisted, the insecurity in her voice betraying her vulnerability. He looked up again, this time with a serious expression. "No, princess. Why would it bother you?" Zuri was silent, surprised by the simplicity of the answer. Because everyone else avoids me," he admitted, his voice breaking. He shrugged, as if it wasn't relevant. "Your smell is strong, yes," he said, with an honesty that would have been rude if it had not been accompanied by such a gentle tone. "But your pain, this is even more evident." There was a long silence between the two. His words kept echoing in Zuri's mind. No one in the entire kingdom had spoken to her like that. No pity, no contempt, just truth. He stood up, wiping his hands on his pants, and took a step towards her, but stopped at a respectful distance. "My name is Tariq," he said. "I'm a healer from the village of Nyota. My job is to take care of what is hurt or broken. Sometimes people, other times the things we can't see." Zuri blinked, confused. "I'm not hurt. I'm defective." Tariq shook his head, denying it. "Flaws don't exist, just differences. And differences, princess, are what make the world interesting." She didn't know what to answer. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that seemed to penetrate your heart. Tariq, noticing her hesitation, pointed to the grass where there were small yellow flowers. "Look at these plants. They grow up in the middle of it all, in places that no one pays attention to. For many, they're just useless weeds. But for me, they're the cure for fevers." He bent down again, picking one of the flowers, and offered it to her. Zuri hesitated before taking it. "What does this have to do with me?" he asked, looking at the small gift. He smirked. "Sometimes things that seem like a problem are actually a solution. We just need to learn to look at it differently." The sun began to disappear over the horizon, turning the sky an intense red. Tariq stood up again, adjusting his leather bag full of herbs. "I need to go, but if you want to talk again, I'll be here." He nodded goodbye and started walking towards the village. Zuri stood still, watching him until he disappeared into the trees. Something inside her had changed. For the first time in months, she didn't feel completely alone. Tarek hadn't just seen past her scent. He had heard her, understood. And maybe, she thought, there was something to be discovered about herself that she hadn't yet realized. Zuri and Tarek's days became a haven of happiness in the midst of a world that didn't seem to understand them. Tarek was the only person who saw beyond the marks Zuri's scent had left on his reputation. To him, she was like the flowers that grew on the banks of streams, resilient, unexpectedly beautiful, and with a strength that few could see. Together they explored the fields around Nyota's palace and village, laughing, talking, and dreaming of a future where the pain they carried was no longer a burden. However, the tranquility they had built began to shatter when the first rumors arrived. The news spread like the wind. A mysterious disease, described as an invisible shadow, crossed nearby villages, bringing extremely high fevers and deadly fatigue that seemed to drain the life of those infected. The first victims appeared in Nyota. Tarek, as a healer, was called to help. Zuri insisted on accompanying him, determined to prove to herself that she was more than the stigma she carried. Together, they entered the humble homes, where people were fighting a fever that burned like the desert sun. The bittersweet smell of illness, mixed with herbs and improvised medicines, saturated the air, making the environment heavy and suffocating. Despite the growing fear, Tarek remained calm. Zuri, although hesitant, followed his instructions, cleaning wounds, preparing teas, and comforting the sick. The weeks passed, and the disease proved merciless. More and more bodies were buried in the fields by moonlight, in quick ceremonies, performed by those who were still healthy enough to carry the dead. The village itself seemed to be falling ill, the fields silent, the markets empty. Zuri and Tarek became inseparable, a duo who moved among the sick with a courage that hid the beating fear in their hearts. They worked tirelessly, their hands occasionally intertwining as they passed medicine to each other, the glances exchanged carrying more than words could express. Then came the inevitable. One gray morning, when the sun had barely risen, Zuri woke up with an unbearable heat consuming her body. His head was throbbing, and his breathing was heavy. Tarek, seeing her in that state, froze for a moment, fear evident in his eyes. But he quickly returned to his role as a healer. "You'll get through this, Zuri," he said, his voice a mix of determination and desperation. He carried her to a hut on the outskirts of the village, away from other sick people, and began to treat her with the same dedication he showed to everyone else. For days, he remained by her side, dabbing her forehead with damp cloths, administering medicine, and murmuring words of encouragement as she was delirious with fever. Zuri didn't remember much about those days. Everything was a blur of heat and darkness and Tarek's voice, which seemed to be the only thing keeping her connected to the world. One night, as she slept, he whispered, his voice low and full of emotion, "Even if I don't survive, knowing that you're alive is enough." The words hung in the air, like a secret confessed to the wind, and Tarek continued his work, ignoring the exhaustion that threatened to bring him down. When Zuri finally opened her eyes, feeling the weight of her fever lift, the cabin was silent. The smell that had always accompanied her, that odor that isolated her from everyone, had disappeared. For a brief moment, she felt a wave of relief. Perhaps the illness had taken away not only his strength, but also the invisible burden he carried. But her relief was immediately replaced by an icy emptiness as she realized Tarek wasn't at her side. "Tarek," he called, his voice weak. There was no response. She forced herself to get up, her body feeling heavy but determined to find him. When she finally left the hut, she met a villager who looked at her with a mixture of surprise and sadness. "He was taken," said the man, looking down. "The fever caught him. The others took him to isolation." Zuri's heart seemed to stop. That man who had given everything to help her was now alone, fighting the same disease that had almost killed her. She tried to run towards the place the villager mentioned, but was stopped. "It's too dangerous, princess. He doesn't want you to see him like this." The words were like blades in his soul. What was love without the chance to return it? Without the chance to be with those who matter most when everything seems lost? As the wind blew through the fields, carrying with it the dry leaves of a season that seemed never to end. Zuri realized that her scent might be gone, but the emptiness Tarek left behind was unbearable. And in that moment, she knew her fight was just beginning. The sun shone brightly over the gates of Ukutah's palace, casting golden reflections on the ivory towers and flags that fluttered softly in the wind. The crowd gathered in the central courtyard vibrated with contagious energy. Men, women, and children celebrated the return of Zuri, the princess whose beauty had once again become an object of admiration. There was no longer the odor that previously alienated everyone around him. The illness that almost took her also seemed to have taken away the invisible weight she was carrying. When she walked through the gates, riding a bejeweled white horse, the acclaim was instantaneous. People shouted his name like a hymn, throwing flowers and bowing in reverence. Zuri kept her chin up, her posture perfect, as she took in every moment of that adoration. In the great hall of the palace, King Wenyu was waiting for her, surrounded by the kingdom's advisors and nobles. When she entered, the room fell silent, as if everyone was holding their breath. Wenyu stood up, his eyes shining with a pride he could not contain. "My daughter," he said, his voice firm but full of emotion. "You have returned to us healed, strong, and more beautiful than ever. Today, the kingdom of Ukutah celebrates its resilience." Zuri bowed slightly, accepting her father's words as the acknowledgement she had always wanted. This was the moment she had been waiting for since she was a child, to be admired, respected, and finally accepted. But behind the serene smile, there was something stirring in his chest. A growing pride was beginning to turn into something darker. She was no longer the isolated and rejected princess. Now, she was seen as a hero, a survivor. And with this new position came a sense of superiority, an invisible barrier that she began to erect between herself and those who once looked down on her, or even those who had been by her side when no one else was. As the days turned into weeks, Zuri took her position in the palace with renewed confidence. People came from all parts of the kingdom to see her, to offer gifts, to seek her blessing. She, in turn, began to enjoy the attention and power she now possessed. Her time in the fields alongside Tarek seemed more and more distant, as if it were a story from another life. But that distance was abruptly broken when Tarek returned. The news reached the palace on a hot afternoon, brought by a messenger who seemed uncomfortable delivering the message. "Nyota's healer," he said, his voice wavering, "has survived the plague and is on his way." Zuri felt her heart speed up. Tarek was alive. For a moment, a wave of relief coursed through his body, but with it came a pang of apprehension. He knew her in a way no one else did, a part of her she was beginning to bury. When Tarek arrived, escorted by guards, the contrast between him and the splendor of the palace could not be more evident. He was thin, his face marked by scars from the disease, and his skin, once bright and vibrant, looked pale and tired. Even so, his eyes still had that calm glow, a quiet determination that Zuri knew so well. He looked at her with a smile that seemed to carry months of longing and suffering. "Zuri," he said, his voice soft but firm, "are you well? I knew you would be." She felt a lump in her throat, but pride quickly took over. She crossed her arms, maintaining a distance that seemed impenetrable. "Yes, Tarek," she replied, her voice cold. "I am fine. The kingdom has welcomed me back, and now, everything is as it should be." Tarek frowned, taking a step forward. "What about us? You're not even going to ask me how I survived? Or what happened while you were here?" Zuri looked away, discomfort growing inside her. "I appreciate what you did for me, Tarek, but I'm different now. I cannot associate with you." The words came out before she could stop them, and the silence that followed was heavy. Tarek stood still, as if her words had hit him like a physical blow. He took a deep breath, fighting the hurt that clearly crossed his face. "Zuri," he said finally, his voice thick with sadness. "Do you remember who was there for you when everyone rejected you? When no one else could stand to even be in the same room as you?" She hesitated, but maintained her posture. "I remember, Tarek, but that doesn't matter anymore. I'm not the same person. What happened is in the past." Tard shook his head slowly, the weight of her words falling on him like stones. "No matter how much the world sees you as a hero now," he said, his voice low but firm, "what really matters is who you were when no one else was watching." He took a step back, his posture still upright, but his expression making it clear that he would not press further. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Zuri. And I hope that one day you remember what it truly means to be loved for who you are." When he left, the hall seemed empty despite the luxury around it. Zuri remained in the same place, feeling a mixture of anger and confusion. Part of her knew he was right, but the pride that now defined her wouldn't let her admit it. As the hall doors closed behind Tariq, she felt as if something precious was leaving forever. However, instead of facing him, she chose to ignore the tightness in her chest, turning back to her new admirers, trying to convince herself that what she had now was enough. But deep down, Tariq's words echoed, impossible to ignore. Okata's palace was busier than ever. After weeks of celebrations for Zuri's cure, she had become the center of the kingdom's social life. Meetings in the Great Hall were filled with laughter, music, and flattery. Every step Zuri took was followed by admiring glances, and her every word seemed to carry the weight of newfound authority. But that day, as he walked through the marble halls of the palace, something strange began to happen. First, it was an almost imperceptible sensation, a slight change in the air around him, as if something familiar was returning. Then came the looks, no longer of admiration, but of hesitation. People nearby began to discreetly move away, and the whispers, which she knew so well, reappeared. Zuri stopped in the middle of the hallway, her heart racing. A smell, that smell, the burden she believed she had left behind was back, like an unwanted shadow. She tried to convince herself it was her imagination, but the expression on the face of a nearby servant, who quickly backed away as he passed her, confirmed her worst fears. Desperate, she ran to her quarters, locking the door behind her. There, in the solitude of his luxurious room, what was once pride began to turn into panic. What did this mean? Why now? As he looked at his reflection in the golden mirror, tears began to stream down his face. All the acceptance he had experienced, all the status he had achieved, it all seemed to fall apart again. The next day, the hall was emptier than usual. Zuri walked down the stairs slowly, trying to ignore the avoided glances and muffled murmurs. When he entered, an awkward silence took over the space. His presence, which had previously brightened the room, now seemed to cause discomfort. King Winyi, sitting on the throne, looked at her with concern. "Zuri," he said, his voice filled with care but also disappointment. "What's going on? Is this smell back?" She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, she turned and left, unable to bear the weight of the judgment. His world, which had seemed so solid, was falling apart again. Not knowing where to go, Zuri instinctively headed out of the palace. Her feet took her to the surrounding fields, the ones she knew so well. The wind was blowing, bringing the scent of wild flowers, but that wasn't enough to erase the smell that seemed to haunt her. And it was there in the middle of that void that the idea emerged. Tariq, he was the only person who had never judged her, who saw beyond everything that seemed to define her. But she had rejected him, hurt him deeply. Would he even listen to her now? There was no other choice. Zuri knew she needed to find him. After hours of walking, she arrived at the village of Nyota. The simple houses and the market were quiet, the plague still leaving its scars. Asking here and there, she finally found her way to Tariq's hut. When she arrived, she paused for a moment, hesitation weighing on her. But before he could reconsider, Tariq appeared in the doorway. He looked stronger than the last time I saw him, but the marks of illness were still on his face. He saw her and froze for a moment, his expression neutral, but his eyes carrying a mixture of surprise and hurt. "Zuri," he said simply. She fell to her knees before he could say anything else. "Tariq," he began, his voice shaking. "I was foolish. You were the only one who really saw me, and I abandoned you. I let myself be carried away by pride, by adulation. I forgot who I was, and now Now I'm back where I started. Tarek was silent for a long moment, looking at her. Finally, he came closer, kneeling to her level. Zuri, he said, his voice calm but firm, love is not perfect, but he always forgives. He reached out his hand to her, and Zuri took it, feeling the warmth of understanding and forgiveness she didn't believe she deserved. Tarek helped her to her feet, guiding her to the field, where the sun was setting, dyeing the sky in shades of orange and pink. There, in the middle of nature that had always been a refuge for both of them, they talked. Tarek spoke about the true meaning of love and acceptance, not just of others, but of herself. The smell isn't the problem, Zuri, he said. The problem is what you believe it means. Until you can accept every part of who you are, the world will always find something to judge. Zuri looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, she felt genuine calm. The weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, she knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but with Tarek by her side, she was ready to face whatever came. And, most importantly, she was ready to face herself. If you enjoyed this video, please help us grow by subscribing to this humble channel. And if you'd like to watch more videos like this, we prepared the next video especially for you. Click here to watch.